And welcome. I am so glad that you are here tonight and that you've made time to be part of this speaker series here in our church. I want to take a moment just to offer. For those of you who came in after we began to serve food, please know that the food was blessed. So I'm going to offer another prayer for us as we prepare to hear Rabbi Amy. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Break down the walls that separate us, unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth. That in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. And all of this we ask in your holy name. Amen. I am really happy to be able to introduce to you Rabbi Amy Fader. Rabbi Amy and I don't really know each other than through a Zoom meeting that we were both part of. And I just want to, before I introduce her formally, I just want to thank her for her gracious response to me when I reached out to her and said, I know we don't really know each other, but would you be willing to come to my church and talk? And she responded almost immediately and said, yes, thank you for asking. So I always like people like you, Amy. So thank you so much for being so responsive. Some of you have had a chance to read a little bit about Rabbi Amy in the brochure that we put together. And if you did or if you did not, then I just want to share a little bit more with you about her and her work and ministry here. She is from St. Louis. She attended Clayton High School, studied Judaics and music at the University of Michigan, and then went to Israel where she studied at Hebrew Union College. She began her work as an assistant at Temple Israel following her ordination as a rabbi, and she was invested as a senior rabbi in 2010, and at that point she became the youngest woman to lead a large Reform congregation. Amy serves at Temple Israel alongside of her husband, Rabbi Michael Alper, and they have two children. And when I was reading a little bit about Amy, I was taken by part of what she says about why she loves being a rabbi, and I want to share this much with you. I seek to inspire others to live in examined ways that bring comfort and joy. By building and nurturing relationships, I quietly remind others that they are not alone and that they can rely on me and the community we create together. That seems to fit pretty well with what we're trying to think about, and that I hope you'll help us think about. So, Rabbi Amy Fader, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I have driven past this church, I can't even tell you how many times, and I've always wanted to come inside, so I'm really thrilled to be here with you tonight. So I was given sort of a very broad idea of what I should say tonight. So I have some ideas, but what I'm going to do is tell you a few things, and then we'll open it up for questions. But also feel free along the way. If you want to ask me anything, you're more than welcome to. So I thought I'd tell you three things tonight. First, a little bit about me and how I ended up being a rabbi. Then a little bit about Judaism and what makes Jews Jews. And then maybe a little bit about what makes Jews not Christians, which I realize you may know, but sometimes folks don't. And so I figured we should at least start with the basics. So first about me. So I did grow up here in St. Louis, and I actually went to Temple Israel, the congregation where I am now a rabbi. But I will tell you that for most of my life, I really had never considered being a rabbi. This was not something I was very interested in. But I always felt sort of like I had some sort of a straight path in front of me, even if I didn't know exactly where it led. And when I went to college, I chose the University of Michigan because I thought it was so big and I would have so many options, and I knew that I would be able to figure out almost immediately what I wanted to do with my life. And then, like most 19-year-olds, I got through my first year of college and I had no idea what I wanted to do. So what happened is after my freshman year of college, I remember I went to Washington, D.C. to go to a concert, and I was sitting on the plane, and I was stressing out about my future. I was really just stressed out, and I had my eyes closed, and I'm sitting there waiting for the flight to take off, and I feel a tap, and I open my eyes, and this woman is sitting next to me, and she smiles at me, and she says, "Excuse me, but what are you?" and I was not very, now I'm relatively good at speaking to strangers. I was not very good at speaking to strangers then, and it was a weird question, so I closed my eyes and I pretended like it hadn't happened, and then she tapped me again, and she said, "Excuse me, but what are you?" Now, I have no idea, actually, to this day, what she was asking, but my immediate response when she said that was, "Well, I'm a Jew." And then I thought, oh, that's a weird thing to say to a stranger on a plane. But for whatever reason, we just started talking. And she started asking me what I wanted to do with my life. And I told her, gosh, I actually don't know. And I went to this college and I thought I'd figure it all out. And I thought that like most adults in my life, she would say, "Well, don't worry, Amy, there will be some sort of a plan." But instead she said, "You sound just like my children." And she told me about one of her children who was a doctor, but who loved to sing to his patients while he worked on them. And another child who she had who was a preacher, but loved to dance. And so actually would sometimes like dance in the streets before she would go on and preach. And one child after another of hers, she had a lot of kids, seemed to have these incredibly fantastic, multifaceted lives and jobs. Somewhere in the course of the flight, she introduced herself to me as Rayella. And when the flight landed, Rayella said to me, she said, "Amy, you have one job in this life. It's to find everything that you love to do and figure out some way to do all of it. And that will be your gift to God." The flight landed, she hugged me, and we never saw each other again. But I thought about her a lot. I mean, I could not stop thinking about this woman, Rayella, and what she said to me, and this idea that I could find all of the things that I loved and somehow put them to use. And then I remembered the first thing that I had said to her: "I am a Jew." And even though still I don't know what the question was that she was asking or why that was my immediate response, but it made me realize that all of the things that I love to do in my life, singing and counseling and teaching and leading and writing, that all of them in some way had this thread of Judaism that connected them. And I realized that maybe the way that I could somehow find a way to use everything that I loved and everything that I was good at was to find some way to do it Jewishly. And so that's how I ended up becoming a rabbi. So that's story number one. Next, we're going to get into what it actually means to be a Jew and to be a rabbi, because I should say that even though I ended up becoming a rabbi, I still wasn't entirely sure. In fact, even though I got through college and I studied music and I studied Judaic studies, but there was still a part of me that wasn't sure I really knew what it meant to be Jewish. Because I'd grown up with Jewish parents, I'd grown up going to Sunday school and going to services, maybe only a couple times a year, but I went to services. And I was very worried that even though I had this idea in my head that maybe I should be a rabbi, I should be some sort of Jewish leader, I was worried that I didn't truly know what it meant to be a Jew. And I thought that maybe I would go off to Israel to rabbinical school and would find out that actually, I was a Buddhist or something else, and wouldn't that be disappointing? And so I give my parents tremendous credit that they said to me, "Amy, the only way that you're going to figure out is if you just go and see." And so I did. So I graduated college, and 2 weeks later, I got on a plane and I moved to Israel. I'll tell you the rest of my personal story later, but I will say also that my first day there, I met a very cute boy who was also studying to be a rabbi. We ended up getting married, so it all worked out very nicely. But I also luckily found that, in fact, I was Jewish. And everything that I had learned, but also everything that I just felt like I knew in my heart, that it really was Jewish. Now, there's lots of different ways to describe what it means to be a Jew, and we'll talk about a few of them, but I would say that the three things that define what it means to be a Jew are God, Torah, and Israel. But all three of those things mean something a little bit different depending on who you're asking. So I'll talk about each of them just for a little bit. I've got to do Torah before I get to God and Israel. So Torah is usually defined as the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But Torah really means teaching. So usually when Jews talk about Torah, they don't mean just those 5 books of Moses. They really mean the entire Hebrew Bible, basically what you all would refer to as the Old Testament, but also all of the teachings that come after it, the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch, all of those which are books which have been written by humans throughout the ages to really make sure that we fully understand the words of Torah. However, if you were an Orthodox Jew, And an Orthodox Jew is someone who, is not going to dress like me. You're not going to see a female Orthodox rabbi. But an Orthodox Jew is someone who looks at the Torah and believes that everything in the Torah was written by God. Full stop. God wrote it, and therefore we should follow it, and we should believe it, and we should not question it. If you're a Reform Jew, which is the tradition in which I was raised, we believe that the Torah in some way was given by God, but Reform Jews are going to have a lot of different interpretations of what that means. Most of us would say that it was inspired by God. So not necessarily that God took God's invisible hand, whatever God's hand looks like, and actually wrote it down with Moses on Mount Sinai, but that somehow the Torah are words that are inspired by God, but also that when God wrote the Torah, God knew that the world was going to change. And God knew that the teachings in the Torah could not be interpreted or understood exactly as they are written, because there would be so many changes throughout the centuries. And we believe as Reformed Jews that God gave us the wisdom to be able to interpret those laws for ourselves and understand them as individuals. So because of that, someone who's Orthodox, who is truly going to follow the letter of the law in the Torah, they would look at a law that says, keep the Sabbath day, and they would try every single way to keep the Sabbath day in all of its specifics, and they would keep it to every extreme. So for instance, when they say don't work on the Sabbath day, they would ask the question, well, what does work mean? It doesn't just mean going to the office. What if it actually means the work of having to pick up your backpack and it's really heavy? Well, you can't do that. You can't pick things up. What if it means the work of creating a fire? Okay, well, most of us aren't creating fires, but I'm not very good at cars, but when you turn the key in your car, there is a little spark in there somewhere. Well, that's a no-no too. So in Orthodox Judaism, they are going to take those laws to an extreme. For me, when I read the commandment in the Torah that says keep the Sabbath day holy and guard it, I say the Sabbath day is going to be a day for me and my family that is going to be special and that is going to be different from the rest of the week. But it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going to do something that others might classify as work. Because to me, cooking a meal for my family doesn't always feel like work. Sometimes it feels like work. But the rest of the time, it doesn't. It's a gift that I get to give to my family and we experience it together. So that is my Reform interpretation. I'm still keeping the Sabbath day if I'm making my family a meal. In the Orthodox community, they would not. My guess is there's more questions about that. We'll come back to it later. But so that's Torah, right? So Torah is teaching. Torah is what we find in our sacred scriptures. Those questions, though, about the idea that God gave us Torah should make us think, well, then who is this God? This is also something that is going to differ a lot from one person to the next in Jewish tradition, and this time not necessarily based on whether you are Reform or Conservative or Orthodox. Who you think God is really something that is going to be very different from person to person. All that you really have to believe in Judaism when it comes to God is that God is one. What that one God looks like, what we call that God, how that God feels about us. Whether or not God is involved in our everyday lives, that is something that is not all that clear just from the Torah, and there are going to be many, many, many different Jewish interpretations over the years about who and what God is. And I'll also be honest to say that there are many people, myself included, who maybe have different ideas of God that don't work all that well together. So I will say that for me, the God that I believe in is very much a God of sort of the medieval Jewish philosophers. I believe in a God who is the order of all existing things, and that we can connect to God by understanding the way that we all come together, the way that the whole world is somehow connected. That's intellectually how I think of God. But every night when I put my kids to bed, we pray to God. And we pray to a God who cares about us and loves us and knows us. And even though that logically is not the same as a God who is the order of all existing things, there's still a part of me that believes that God somehow is a being who loves me and knows me and wants the best for me and is supporting me. Those are both two visions of God that maybe they don't work all that well together, but somehow they work for me. All right, so God, Torah, Israel. When we talk about Israel in Judaism, I should say that most of the time we're talking about the people Israel, not the country of Israel. Now, we can talk more about the country of Israel tonight, but I will at least say that when we talk about the people Israel, what we mean is anyone who defines themselves as Jewish. You can be Jewish if you are born to Jewish parents. You can be Jewish if you convert to Judaism. You can also be part of a Jewish community, and we would still call you part of the people of Israel, even if perhaps you are not officially Jewish. The people of Israel, it's not a race, it's not just a religion. I think the best way to describe the people Israel is to say that we are a tribe. Now, of course, in the modern day, we also talk about the country of Israel. And again, I'm happy to answer questions about the country or the state of Israel if you want, but I will at least acknowledge that there's probably been no week since 1948 that it's been more challenging to talk to people about exactly how I feel about the state of Israel, because Israel is going through a lot right now. So I'm happy to answer questions, but I can just say it is complicated, and every Jew in America feels very complicated about Israel right now and how exactly we should support Israel or not. Okay, so me, God toward Israel, Jews and Christianity. So I was saying to some folks when I came in here that a lot of times at our synagogue, we will have Christian groups come into the synagogue. Often they're teenagers, but we have church groups come in all the time. And more often than not, what they want to know is, well, what makes us similar and what makes us different? And I would actually suggest that there is probably far more that makes Jews and Christians, especially Reformed Jews and Episcopalians, similar than you might imagine. But there are, of course, I'm not going to say that we're exactly the same. There are some beliefs that are different. And usually the three that I would highlight is the biggest things that sort of differ between Judaism and really all types of Christianity. I would say the difference is our perspectives on sin, our view of the afterlife, and Jesus. So sin is the easiest one, weirdly. So in Judaism, we do not believe in the idea of original sin. What we believe is that everyone is born absolutely pure. We have a blessing that we say in our morning services. We say, Elohai neshama shenatata bi Torahi, which means, God, the soul you've given me, she is a pure one. We say this every single morning. Souls are female, by the way. But we say this every single morning and remind ourselves that every day we have the possibility to renew ourselves and be the most pure and good version of ourselves. And so when we talk about something like sin, it is something that we can do and that we can always ask for forgiveness from the person whom we have sinned against. You cannot in any way be cleansed of your sins just by asking God for forgiveness. It has to be between you and the person who you have wronged. When it comes to the afterlife, that's the other big one. This is one of those areas where it's tough to be Jewish. You know, I have a lot of friends who are Christian clergy, and they know, this is one of those times that I'm like, oh, I'm so jealous of you guys, because we don't really have a heaven and a hell, and that makes it very challenging in terms of both teaching people exactly what it means to live a good life when there's not a clear sense of reward and punishment for what comes next, but especially, of course, when we talk about mourning, because Jews, it's not that we definitely don't believe in hell. It's not that we don't believe in heaven, we just don't talk about it that much. And there's really this idea in Judaism that we always say you should just focus on this life. That's why in Fiddler on the Roof he says, to life, l'chaim, right? We are all about this life, and we don't focus on what comes next. And that can be very nice, but that can be very, very hard with someone who is in mourning or is about to lose a loved one. But that is just sort of, we have a very logical side to us as a Jewish people that says that since none of us have been to the afterlife yet, we don't spend a lot of time talking about what we think it might be. And the last piece is about Jesus. And I should preface this by saying that a week or two ago, I was on a panel with a group of young people. They're in a group called Cultural Leadership. And Cultural Leadership is a program that brings together Jewish kids and Black kids and just talks about sort of the similarities and the differences between the Black community and the Jewish community. And I was on a panel with two other rabbis, a conservative rabbi and an Orthodox rabbi, and someone asked a question about Jesus, and I gave my answer, and they both looked at me like, what? So I will give you my answer, but I didn't really realize how different it was than my colleagues. In all types of Judaism, I will say, we do not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. We do not believe that Jesus is any more the son or a child of God than any of us are. Where I differ from my colleagues is that that doesn't mean that we don't talk about Jesus in my synagogue, because we have a lot of interfaith families in our congregation, and we live in America. And so to not talk about Jesus, which is such an important part, really, of what it means to be in America, it feels like we are not giving people honest answers. And so for me, when we talk about Jesus, even though we don't look at Jesus as being God or the Son of God or the Messiah, when I read the Gospels especially, it's very clear to me that Jesus was a rabbi, because rabbi just means teacher. That if Jesus was here today, he would probably be a Reform rabbi, because what Reform rabbis do is we look at Jewish tradition and we say, what is wrong and what isn't working anymore, and how can I make sure that it works in the way that God intended it to work, which, at least when I read the Gospels, I feel like that's what Jesus is trying to say to people. And I also think it's very important, at least for my congregation, that they know the New Testament and they know what Jesus had to say. And actually, one of my favorite lessons is that sometimes I will take the Sermon on the Mount and I will teach it to people, but I'll teach it to them in Hebrew. And so when they read it in Hebrew, it sounds incredibly Jewish. I mean, it sounds like it comes from Tanakh. It sounds like it comes from the Hebrew Bible, and then they are shocked to find out that actually it's from the Gospels. But I think that's so important that they realize that actually there is a lot that we share in terms of how we feel about people in our community, and how we can help the people who are with us. So I do feel very comfortable talking about Jesus. My colleagues who looked at me, who were so shocked, they were like, we do not talk about Jesus in our synagogue. So apparently that's not something that everyone does. But I do feel like it's something that is important, that when we talk about having Jewish and Christian fellowship, that we should know what each other believes and be comfortable having these conversations and saying, where is it that we are similar? Where do we differ? And where is that middle ground where we can still talk together as peers? So I'm going to say one last thing, and then I'm going to turn it to you for questions. Like I said, I grew up here, and I grew up Jewish. And I will say, actually, when I grew up, even though I went to Clayton High School, most of my friends were Jewish. It's not like everyone was Jewish at Clayton, but most of my group was Jewish. And so it really wasn't until I was in rabbinical school that I became good friends with Christians. And my second year of rabbinical school, I worked as an interfaith chaplain at a hospital. And there were a number of us who were all studying to be clergy of one faith or another. But I will say that the people with whom I was the closest were two women who were becoming Episcopalian priests. And we just had a marvelous time learning from each other and just figuring out what we could learn from each other, how we could grow. But at the end of the day, we found that we were very, very similar in how we felt about our faith and how we felt about our community. So it's really a pleasure for me to be able to come now and meet with each of you and really be able to find out just how much more we have in common. So I'm going to pause there because I talked a lot in a short period of time. And I'm going to turn it over for questions. I do want to make sure that if you have a question, we're going to give you the microphone to make sure that everyone can hear you and that we can be recording you. Ooh, really? Oh, there's one in the back.
Several years ago, I was invited to a Rosh Hashanah service and a Yom Kippur service, and I've had friends who are Jewish who invited me to their Passover Seder. And I found it so enriching, and I see where all of our traditions come from. This fall, I've been at your temple for memorial services, and you're amazing. But this past fall, I did the Yom Kippur service down the street from you, and heard the best message on forgiveness I've ever heard.
Wow.
So we share so much in common. Yeah. And I believe that very deeply, and I'm really glad you're here.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, I'm not going to know or be able to pronounce the Hebrew word, but the concept that Jews are called to repair the world, that term. Could you talk a little bit about that and
Sure.
whether we understand it or not?
Sure. So the concept you're talking about is called Tikkun Olam. And Tikkun means to fix, Olam means the world. This is a concept that has been talked about a lot in the past 20 years or so, particularly in my movement, in the Reform movement. And the idea of it, I'm trying to figure out how much to tell you about it. So, I mean, here's, I guess, the gist of it. You may have heard before this idea that the Jews are the chosen people, right? So in Judaism, though, you know, when we talk about being the chosen people, it's not being chosen like you're getting chosen to like get extra presents or something, right? So there's a midrash, a Jewish story that talks about how the Jews ended up the chosen people. And it says that when God was deciding who would be the chosen people, that God went first to one community. He said, will you be my chosen people? And they were like, well, what do we get out of it? And he's like, well, you're going to get a lot of laws. And they were like, nope, we're not going to be the chosen people. And then God went to the next people and said, would you like to be my chosen people? And they also said, well, you know, what's in it for us? And he said, well, you're not going to be able to eat bacon, and you're not going to be able to eat shrimp. And they said, nope, not for us. And the Midrash says that God went to one group of people after another, and then until it says, God got to the lowliest people of all, the Jews. And God went and God lifted Mount Sinai up over their heads and said, will you be my chosen people? At which point they were like, okay, you know, whatever you say. So there is this idea, so what does it mean to be chosen? Well, first of all, it's not necessarily like chosen because it's so awesome. What it means, though, is that we believe that when God made the world, that there was an inherent sense of brokenness in it, that there were some things in the world that were just not quite right. Some people even say it started with that big bang, right, that maybe broke a few things. And so in the beginning, there was this brokenness that was sort of written into the fabric of the world. And when God chose the Jewish people, God said, you're going to be my partners in helping to fix the world. And so we believe that what it means to be chosen is to be God's partners in this act of Tikkun Olam, fixing the world. And certainly in Reform Judaism, we tend to use that term really like hand in hand with meaning social justice. Now, of course, it means something different for everyone, but really it's this idea that we don't follow God's laws or do good things because they feel good, even though sometimes they do. We do it because we think that it is our obligation. And a lot of times when people talk about what it means to be Jewish, you know, it's not a fun thing, right? I mean, we are a persecuted people. And so there's this idea in the very essence of Judaism that says, this is our job and you have no choice. You're just going to do it because you're God's partners. And so there's something very holy in that, and there's something very hard in that. But that's really sort of the gist of what Tikkun Olam is.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here tonight. We have an imam coming next week, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the, I guess, intersection of Islam and Judaism. The Muslims have half of it is they all believe in Abraham, Jesus as a prophet, and a lot of the Jewish history and stuff, but I just wonder if you could comment on the differences between the two.
Sure. I mean, so personally, the Quran is a little bit harder for me to read than the New Testament. But that having been said, when it comes to and just because it's not linear, if you've ever tried to read the Quran before, it's not quite as sort of easy to follow. That having been said, there are probably more similarities in Judaism and Islam than there are in either Judaism and Islam and Christianity. Judaism and Islam, we both have the Sabbath. We both have to pray a certain amount of times a day. We both do certain kinds of washing before we pray. We both have these eating laws. There are a lot of similarities between Judaism and Islam. And for most of Jewish history, actually, the times when Jews were the most safe was when we were living in Muslim countries. In most Muslim countries throughout history, Jews were considered people who were, dhimmi is the word, D-H-I-M-M-I, protected people, because Jews were people of the book. And Muslims really honored the idea that Jews had these sacred scriptures. I think now when people look at the conflict between Jews and Muslims, it's almost all rooted in the current conflicts in the Middle East and what's happening in Israel and Palestine. It's really, though, not actually about Judaism and Islam. There are very few conflicts between those two faiths. And I think it's, I mean, Imam Hosek is wonderful, and I think it's fantastic that he's coming to speak to you too, because I still think that most of us have a hard time understanding what Islam is, and it's amazing to find out that it's actually not very foreign to what any of us believe in.
Amy, will you say a little bit more about how you handle things pastorally when you're not able to say this is what it's going to look like, you know, in the next part of life with no heaven, no. How do you deal with that from a standpoint of helping people to feel a sense of hope?
I mean, it is incredibly hard, and I will say, you know, because you're asking the question, pastorally, I will also say that I have spent enough time with people who are at the end of their life that I do believe there is something, you know, that I've had enough encounters with people who are in those last moments of their life who seem to see someone or see something that I actually do have faith that there is something that is waiting for us. It's just not as clear as it is, I think, in so many Christian scriptures. What I will say, though, is that when we, you know, if you were to ever come to a Jewish funeral, what you will find is that everything about the Jewish mourning process is, it's an ancient process that could have been written by a psychologist today. Like, every aspect of it is meant to help people understand how to deal with their grief. And you have these various markers along the way that are supposed to make sure that people fully understand the loss and are facing it, but also are surrounded by community at all times, so they have opportunities to share stories about their loved ones and to remember them in certain acts. I mean, Judaism has these really wonderful mourning traditions that I think are unparalleled when people follow them. It's just that the idea of heaven and hell is not as clear, and the idea of also theodicy is not as clear. The idea of sort of, you know, why evil exists in the world, and those questions are a little bit harder, I think, for us, because also we also don't believe in the devil, right? So we don't believe that there is some sort of bad being in the world. Also, for us, we believe that God is everything, and that's very scary, because if God is everything, then that means that God has a hand in creating good and evil. You know, the prophet Isaiah says that. We talk about it in our prayer book, and we tone it down a little bit. We also say it in Hebrew. Not everyone speaks Hebrew, so it's okay. So not everyone knows exactly what they're saying, but it is still sort of a part of what we say on a regular basis, that if God creates everything, that means the good and the evil is there. So it is always up to us to choose the good, and to believe that somehow, if God brought us here to this world that has all this potential for beauty and goodness, that whatever God has waiting for us after this world, we're just going to have faith that something is there as well.
Thank you. We have two major feast days, as you know, in the Christian faith, Easter and Christmas, which I really lament that it has been hijacked by secularism. So we have the Easter bunny versus Christ risen, and, you know, Father Christmas. Do you have the same issues with your feast days? Has it been hijacked by secularism or no?
That's a great question. So we have the same problems with your feast days. Because there are a lot of little Jewish boys and girls who really want that Easter bunny and who really love Santa Claus. And so that's actually a conversation that I have to have a lot with people, to remind them that these are not secular holidays, and it is important to actually respect your Christian friends and neighbors, and that these days are sacred to them, and that by sort of taking them over with Hallmark movies and, you know, and all of the treats and everything, that you're taking something a little bit away from people who are true Christian believers. In our own holidays, there are certainly holidays that their significance has changed because of how they've been secularized. The one that is the most known is Hanukkah. Actually, the primary reason that Hanukkah has been secularized is also because of Christmas, because Hanukkah is usually very close to Christmas, and so that's why, you think about Adam Sandler, we've got 8 crazy nights, right? So, like, we don't really have 8 crazy nights. I mean, the idea of Hanukkah is a holiday about a military victory, and it was never intended to be that big of a holiday, but at least in America, because of its proximity to Christmas and not wanting the Jewish kids to feel left out, it has become a gift-giving holiday, which really it isn't at all. But most of the other holidays I think, are not as problematic. We just finished a holiday yesterday, the holiday of Purim. And Purim is when we read the book of Esther. That is actually supposed to be the really fun holiday on the Jewish calendar, and everyone dresses in costume, and you eat a lot of sweets, and you give sweets to friends, and you give charity, and you put on plays and stuff. It's a really that is a really fun holiday, but it's one that has it's people call it like the Jewish Halloween, which it's not the Jewish Halloween, but you do at least get to dress in costume.
I have a question and then a comment. My question is about the God is a happy God with Moses. He reunites his people and he saves them, and he wants his children to succeed. So I share that Reform philosophy. I see it in Christianity and Judaism, and I like that part of the Bible better than Sodom and Gomorrah. God rains down fire and destruction even on innocent little babies. So what I'm trying to say is I think we share much in common, and that God is a happy God. He wants goodness for creation. My other thought is, and that continues into the Sermon on the Mount, for instance. We share with your Reform views that we should help others. That Jewish word that I didn't. Anyway, that's what I want to say. That we're from a similar cut of fabric. Then my other comment. It's not a question, but there was a PBS documentary on the State Department from 1933 to 1946, and I never realized how much racism there was in America against Eastern Jewish people, and that the head of the State Department for 15 years in the Roosevelt administration was racist and blocked innocents from immigrating into the United States, even when they had relatives here. So tens of thousands of Jewish people died because of the racism that was in the institutionalized. So I just there's a lot of history that hasn't been well documented that is just very shameful. So I don't think you can understand the future without looking back into your own closets.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. I will say, if you have not been there yet, there is a new Holocaust museum. Yes. Yeah, that just opened really like in the past month or two here in St. Louis. And it's an interesting museum because it is specifically focused on St. Louis and survivors who came to St. Louis and what their stories were. So it's on the J campus. It's a really wonderful experience. I'll also say, Temple Israel, where we are now, Temple Israel is 137 years old as a congregation, but our building right down the street from you has not been there for that long. It's been there for like 50 years. But when we moved to that building, I say we, I was not alive then, but when the congregation moved to that building, there was actually a fight that went all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court because they did not want to sell that land to Jews. and that's only 50 years ago, which is really kind of remarkable. And now, this is a very Jewish neighborhood, so it is amazing, I think, for us to realize just how much anti-Semitism there was even a generation or two back. And of course, we do see it raising its ugly head again. I was going to say something about God. You talked about the idea of God and sort of this God who wants the good from us. In Judaism, we read the Torah from beginning to end every single year, and we all read it in the exact same cycle. So any Shabbat, any Sabbath that you are going to go to a synagogue, doesn't matter if you're here or in Ethiopia or in Spain or in Israel or in New York, wherever you are, we're all going to be reading the same section. And so this week is when we read the story of the golden calf. And so sometimes God is not cool, right? Like that is not a story where God necessarily likes us, but there is this idea that God is sort of always trying to get the people of Israel and the people of all the world to sort of be the best versions of themselves. But the word Israel, which is who we refer to ourselves as, the people Israel means God wrestler. And so it's also a big part of being Jewish that we are very comfortable having conversations about God and even saying, when I study with students, like, well, God is really not very nice in this Torah portion. What do you think about that? And that we're always wrestling with who God is and what God wants from us, and even the idea that sometimes God is not the God that we want God to be.
So you mentioned that God is everything, or is one, and I just wondered. So I think sometimes I at least, and I think this may be true often in the Christian tradition, that we think of evil as where God isn't. But it sounds like that's really different from your understanding of God. That God encompasses everything. God encompasses. Are you saying, this is a question? Are you saying that God encompasses all that evil and the bad and the bad intentions and and failure, as well as every rock, tree, and sprig of grass and.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. So I think for us it comes back to not the idea that God is good and or evil, but that God gives us free will. And so we believe that every person has within them the inclination to do good and the inclination to do evil. And the evil things that happen in the world are not because God made evil happen, but because we made choices that somehow brought evil down. Now, it's not to say that there isn't tragedy and loss that we do not bring on ourselves, but it does go back to the idea of sort of God as the order of all things, that even if you are experiencing something horrible and loss, you can still sometimes find God in some moments. If you think about what Mr. Rogers used to say, right, in the darkest of times, where's the goodness? You look for it in the helpers, right? Like that's a very, Mr. Rogers obviously was not Jewish, but it's a very Jewish idea of this idea that the goodness is still there and the evil is either just something that happened or it's poor choices that people made, but that somehow there can still be goodness in even the darkest times.
How do you think Christians could read the Old Testament better?
Oh.
Because we do look for Christ in the Old Testament all the time, sometimes really explicitly and sometimes not so explicitly. But how do you think we could maybe adopt some different perspectives on the Old Testament?
Good question. Okay, so I'll say two things. The first is that when Jews study Torah, we don't just take out a Bible and start reading. We look at the Torah and we look at commentaries that have been written on it for the past, 2,500 years. It is like being in a book club that spans centuries and, millions of people. And so for me, that's a big part of it, is not reading Bible in a vacuum, because we believe that you need to sort of understand all of the commentaries, and certainly it helps if you also know the Hebrew and knows the essence of what it means. But I also think the idea of looking for Jesus in it, I'm trying to think sort of what analogy I can use here. So my daughter just finished The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. which I love. And I said, oh, do you know that Aslan is really supposed to be Jesus? And she's like, Mom, you just ruined the whole thing for me. Now I know that he's going to die and he's going to come back. And I did. I totally ruined the whole book for her. But because she knew what to look for, that was how she was reading the book. In her head, she knew what was coming and she knew the clues to look for along the way. I think that if you are reading the book looking for when Jesus is going to come, of course you're going to find Jesus. It's more saying, like, who wrote this in the first place? And we're probably never going to know who wrote the Hebrew Bible, right? I mean, it would be very cool if we did, but if we don't know who wrote it, it's more the idea of trying to think, what if this was just written by someone like you or me so many years before Jesus? They probably weren't writing it with Jesus in mind. And so it's that way of sort of separating yourself from the knowledge that you already know in your heart. You already can, read about the different passages in Isaiah that you know are talking about Jesus, but to me they're not. And so it's just thinking, like, what if I shifted my frame of reference to really look at this as someone, whether it was God or Moses or, some person 2,000 years ago, wrote these stories down that had been passed from generations to generation to teach us something, and then felt if there were more possibilities there. And part of my job, because we read Torah every single year, is that I'm reading the exact same book, and every time I get to, the first week of March or so, I'm always reading the story about the golden calf, and I always have to interpret it differently for people. It's a wonderful mental exercise to try and read something from a different perspective every time you read it. And so I think it's really that, coming at it with trying to have fresh eyes, if that's possible.
What do you call, when Moses was on the mountain and God appeared or whatever, what is that called in Hebrew or?
Revelation?
There's another word. A friend of mine was explaining it to me, and I never heard of the word. I don't know if it was Hebrew or what it was, but it was that subject.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different words for revelation, so I'm not sure what Hebrew term they would have been thinking about. But we talk about in our prayer service, we talk about the idea of creation, redemption, and revelation. Those are like the three themes that are in any service that you are going to come to on, anytime you're worshiping with the Jewish community. And so that idea of revelation, that somehow God gave us the Torah and gave us these sacred scriptures, whether or not you believe it actually happened on Mount Sinai or whether you believe that it was passed from one generation to the next, that is definitely sort of one of the keys of our tradition.
Well, that explains it better for me. I don't know what the word was, but I was like, I can't even remember it, but that's what it meant.
Okay, I'm going to change track a little bit here. You mentioned Islam and Judaism has food type, restriction type things, which is one of the very visible differences between St. Peter's, where we have a big tray of bacon every Sunday morning at our breakfast. Yeah. So how, in the Reformed Jewish tradition, how has the food restrictions changed, and where are they today?
So remember in the beginning when I was talking about the difference between Orthodox and Reform. So in an Orthodox synagogue, someone who's Orthodox is going to read all of the teachings about food that are in the Torah and really sort of take them to an extreme. So like there's the teaching that says you shall not boil a goat, by the way, a kid in its mother's milk. Right, so they look at that and they say, okay, so you shouldn't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. Gross, that feels sort of disrespectful, right? But then they would say, well, maybe that means that you should never cook goat in milk. Maybe that actually means that you should never cook any animal in milk. Maybe that means you shouldn't have chicken and milk. So then you can have, chicken parmesan. And maybe that means that, well, what if I have a hamburger and I want to have ice cream? I probably shouldn't put them on the same plate. Or, maybe I should wait 3 hours between the hamburger and the ice cream. And you can see how it just builds and builds and builds to the point that if you're eating with someone who is an Orthodox Jew, they are going to have a tremendous amount of restrictions on what they can eat In St. Louis, by the way, we have 2 kosher restaurants. 2. There's only 2 of them that are fully kosher, so most people who follow Orthodox Jewish eating laws, they are eating in their home because there are so many rules that there's just not enough places in St. Louis that are willing to do that. The rules for kashrut are very similar to the rules for halal in Islam. So that would be someone who's Orthodox. But in Reform Judaism, because we believe that God gave us these rules and then intended us to interpret them ourselves, it means that everyone can do it very differently. So my husband and I are both rabbis. So for me, I look at those laws and I look back at that idea of thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk, and I say, I can get how that's a little bit disturbing, this idea that, you would just have, this animal would just have a baby and now it's being cooked in the life force, and I read these rules, and for me, my personal decision after reading that is that I'm a vegetarian. My husband, again, also a Reform rabbi, reads those laws and he says, I can see that these laws were created to keep us apart, and probably were created to help people be healthy, because we probably all know people who have shellfish allergies, right? And people used to get trichinosis all the time from eating pork. And he says maybe these laws were actually put in the Torah just for health reasons, but over time, he believes they are one of the greatest causes of anti-Semitism, because if you cannot eat in someone else's home, it causes problems. Breaking bread between people is a very, very important thing. And if someone says to you, oh no, I'm sorry, I can't eat in your home, no one takes that well. It really hurts your feelings. And so for him, even though he is more Jewishly observant than I am in every other way, he does not follow the laws of kashrut at all, because he thinks that they are actually a detriment to the Jewish people. Those are both 2 perfectly valid Reform Jewish ways to look at the food laws. And there's, many sort of flavors in between.
So he could come to breakfast.
He could come to breakfast. I think he doesn't really eat bacon, but not specifically for that reason. More because, the arteries and all that. So.
Amy, this has been wonderful.
Oh,
Thank you so much. Really grateful for you being here, and hope that we can have an opportunity to be together in some way and share between our 2 congregations.
And if you ever would like the opportunity to bring a group to services, we would love to have you. We're literally 4 minutes away from you. So anytime, you're more than welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here.